All right, so I'll kind of describe a little bit how I started to understand my grandpa's existential metapsychiatry. So, like I said, my grandpa started teaching me again, and I read one book from Dr. Hora, and I was reading it with my grandpa. My grandpa was living in Texas, but I was reading him with him over the phone, and basically what Dr. Hora was teaching was he was saying that you basically create your reality. You know, but he takes responsibility to a whole nother level. Like he says that if there's a storm, it's because you created it. And the way that he describes it is he looks at the book of Genesis, where Abraham tries to appeal to God to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And according to God, if there's just one righteous person in the city, he will not destroy it. And there wasn't one righteous person. So Dr. Hora says, if there's if there's destruction, if there's an earthquake, if there's anything, if you were righteous, if you had existentially valid thoughts, it would not have happened. So this is like to the extreme. So it's kind of new age. Like you take responsibility for everything. So when I started reading this from Dr. Hora, I started to understand, okay, this is why my grandpa's so into taking responsibility. Now, my grandpa would say, even if it's not true, like, about The Secret, like, you create your reality. Even if it's not true, it's best to see things that way. Because my grandpa said, you can't control, like genes. Like, because I wanted to believe, no, grandpa, that's victim blaming. If someone gets cancer, a lot of it has to do with genetics. A lot of it has to do with, mainly like genes and stuff. But like I said, why did I want to believe that? Because I was very much against victim blaming, and Susan Sontag was a Jewish woman who was also against victim blaming, and she was against the idea that that your diseases are created by yourself. By my grandpa would say it's not the self, by not being in the flow. But I think that I was so into the idea of like being against victim blaming and thinking like, yeah, it's because of genes and stuff. Because like I said, I wanted to think. Like, I didn't like the Bible where it would be like, oh, the Jews were destroyed because of their sins. I'd be like, no. The Syrians didn't take over the Jews because of their sins. It was because the Syrians were stronger. It was Darwinism. Different genetic groups fight. And then after the Jews were conquered, because they were a smaller nation, they justified it by saying, oh, it was God. But that was superstition. And that's the conservative tendency of humans to want to blame the victim, even yourself, because that maintains society. Because religion maintains society. It maintains order, and that's good for genes. So I wanted to see everything through the Darwinian lens. But now I understand what my grandpa's saying. Like, okay, you have to do. My grandpa would say, take responsibility. All you can do is control if you're in the flow or not. And now I realized I wasn't in the flow, and the reason why I wanted to believe that was because I was expressing dualistic software. I was anti-white. I was, that's why I was a Marxist, and I was against victim blaming. But now I see why my grandpa was, for taking responsibility, because the idea is, yes, because when I saw things through a Darwinian lens, it did affect me in a negative way, because it allowed me to think that promiscuity is okay. Like I would just I'll just give an example. Like Myron would be like, yeah, it's good for women to be, non-promiscuous, because that's good for the man's genes, because a man can't be certain of paternity. But if I look at my grandpa said, don't look at things through that lens, because again, then I'm going to justify promiscuity by myself, because I want to spread my genes a lot. And my grandpa said promiscuity is not existentially valid because it leads to suffering. It doesn't lead to happiness. So instead, you don't care about, okay, I want a woman because she's going to help me spread my genes. Instead, you think this woman, you're not, my grandpa say, seek first the kingdom of heaven. And my grandpa say that's the flow, and that's inquiry and study and expanding your awareness. And then everything else comes unto you. If you're in the flow, then you don't have to worry about trying to get a woman who's this way or that way, who's submissive, and you don't care about that. You care about what's going to be optimal in you seeking the kingdom of heaven, which is the flow, which is inquiry, right? So, but if I'm looking at things through a Darwinian materialistic lens, then like I said, I might be trying to have sex with girls, trying to get them pregnant, and not thinking in terms of, being a beneficial presence. And like I said, my whole life I did see things through a Darwinian lens, because I was anti-religion and I wanted to destroy religion. So like an example of that would be like when I thought about the like, you know, the Catholics, they have the priestly class and the people, the monks, the men who are monks. And I thought, yeah, well, that's because, you know, it's not because they want to be spiritual. It's because a lot of societies have an overabundance of males, and a lot of them are homosexuals because they were second born, and second born men have more estrogen in the womb. And, you know, I want to see things through a materialistic lens. And so, you know, and you want to decrease competition among men. So you put them in, you make them into monks. And then the men who are really weaker then can feel superior by being like, oh, we're monks. And then that, you know, decreases the competition among men in society. And then that helps the society's genes, because then the alpha male men can have more women, and the women will be happier, the men will be happier, there's less competition, and then the society is better, and people want a more peaceful society because that's good for genes. So I want to see everything through a Darwinian lens, but I denied what my grandpa taught about the reality of the spiritual, the reality that my grandpa would say, no, it's not Darwinism that runs things. It's everything is one, everything is energy, and it's moving toward the flow and anti-entropy. And you want to be a beneficial presence, as opposed to seeing yourself as a separate person, beneficial person, seeing myself as a separate person, wanting to be superior, wanting to spread my genes. Instead of that, seeing everything as one, and then, you know, and being a beneficial presence. So, like, another example of that would be, another example would be, like I said, I was always kind of anti-white because I think it's because I saw myself as Jewish, and so, like, an example of that would be, like, I remember in INTP Central in 2013, you know, because I was anti-religion and stuff, I wanted to be like, yeah, the Greek philosophers, they were Ionian Greeks, so they were more brown, because I wanted to see brown is better than white, because I saw white people as the biggest threat. So my grandpa, again, would say that was my dualistic software. So I wanted race mixing, but again, my seeing things in a Darwinian perspective and wanting race mixing and stuff, I want to do that to help the Jews, but that ends up hurting the Jews. Because then, like I said, then I'm going to then I'm not going to be living in an existentially valid way, because I'm seeing things through a Darwinian perspective. And also, the irony is, you know, then people say, hey, you know, Jews are bad. They want to race mix us. And then they want to end up fighting you because you're not in the flow. So again, that's why you seek first the kingdom of heaven, which is, my grandpa say, transcending dualistic software. Oneness consciousness, seeing everything as one, and then pure awareness to see things as they really are, you know. And like I said, I think I was in the Darwinian lens, and, you know, because I was more anti-white and more of a Marxist lens, and that's not necessarily existentially valid, you know. So the other example would be like I said, but then when I became more religious, when I went from being anti-white Marxist to being more religious and more of a right winger, you know, then I started to see things like, you know, like I went to the Orthodox Jewish place, and the rabbi was saying, yeah, it wasn't the Greeks that fought Israel, it was the Syro-Phoenician Greeks. Because I want to be like, yeah, it was the Greeks, you know, and the Bible's about Marxism and you know, defeating the white man, and the white man's the bad guy. But then he's like, no, it's the Syro-Phoenician Greeks. They were brown Greeks. They were Arab Greeks that fought the Jews. So I'm like, oh, okay. So it's the white people aren't the bad guys. It's the brown people are the bad guys. Because I went from being anti-white to pro-white. And then also, like, the other example would be, you know, I wanted to believe, oh, you know, the New Testament was a metaphor for the destruction of the Roman Empire, destruction of the white races, you know, by the Jews, you know, because the white races are evil. Like the Amalekites, they want to destroy the Jews, and they don't give to the Jews. You know, they're not Marxists. So, you know, but Jesus was a Marxist. That's what I wanted to believe, because I was kind of anti-white, and I saw white people as the biggest threat to the Jews. But then, you know, then I start studying, and it says, and they say, no, it wasn't the white Romans that fought the Jews. It was the Arab Roman legions that fought the Jews, because the Jews were still in Israel, and those Arabs who were a part of the Roman Empire who fought the Jews. And I'm like, okay, yeah, so it's the brown people who are the bad guys. So I went from being anti-white to pro-white. But again, you know, if you're in the flow, you're not necessarily anti or pro anything. You're not, because that's dualistic software. You're just in inquiry, and you're trying to seek the truth, and you're in pure awareness, and you see things as they really are. But, you know, there is no formula for the flow. Okay. So, but like I said, I was always anti-victim blaming. So like an example of that would be when I read the story of Job and Eliphaz. Eliphaz is one of the Job's helpers, and I think that he might have been an Amalekite, or he might have been an Edomite, and the Edomites mixed with the Hittites who are white, right? So I want to be like, oh, he's a white guy. And Eliphaz means love of gold. So I'm like, yeah, the Bible is Marxist. And the white people like Laban, Laban means white, and he mistreats Jacob, who's the progenitor of Israel. And I'm like, yeah, I get, this is anti-white, and this is the white people, mistreating the brown people, and the brown people having Marxist revolutions. Like Samson was fighting the Philistines. The Philistines are the white people. They're Indo-Europeans. And then there's a Marxist revolution, and that's represented by the jawbone. And yeah, this is all about Marxist revolutions and defeating the white people who are the oppressors. And I want to be like, because Eliphaz, he's trying to tell Job, like, hey, Job, you're responsible. You're responsible for the problems. And I always wanted to think that was white supremacy, to be a victim blamer. And be like, yeah, you're responsible for not being rich. You're responsible. Because I thought, yeah, if you're a white person and you're doing well, then you're going to want to blame the people of color and say, hey, they're responsible. Take responsibility. But then as my grandpa says, Job doesn't really listen. He continues an inquiry. And then at the end, he says that he sees. He said he once heard of God, but now he sees. But that's the flow. But the idea is, I want to be like, yeah, taking responsibility, that's just victim blaming. And yeah, it is genes that makes you get cancer. It's not, my grandpa would say it's not being in the flow makes you more susceptible to cancer. And that's all that you can take responsibility for, is being in the flow. But I want to be like, no, it's genes. Because I didn't want to take responsibility. I didn't like victim blaming. So I wanted to be like, it's not your responsibility. But my grandpa would even say, even if it is genes, you take responsibility. You choose what life you go into based off previous lives, and even like, because I was like, it's crazy to think that you choose if there's a storm, or you choose. I was like, if you choose everything, then how come we're not flying? Wouldn't we choose to fly? My grandpa would be like, no, but before life, you might choose the parameters that you're going to have, like not being able to fly. But regardless, you choose. You take responsibility, you choose. And that's existentially valid to see things that way. But I was looking at things in an existentially invalid way and be like, no, you don't choose. That's victim blaming. I don't like that. But I want to see things in a Darwinian lens, like, no, you get cancer because of genes. But the problem with that is, then I'm looking at things through a Darwinian perspective and not taking responsibility, and then I'm practicing existentially invalid things, as opposed to, my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow and you're taking responsibility, you see everything as energy, you see everything as one. Yes, maybe you can actually, if you're in the flow, not get cancer, and you could even heal someone of cancer if you recognize everything as one, like Jesus could manipulate the energy and stuff, right? Maybe my grandpa's accurate, and you do choose. And someone who gets cancer, they could the victim blaming way would be like, oh, they want it because they want to get attention. Now this is what Dr. Hora taught. And again, I thought Dr. Hora was just a white supremacist because, again, Dr. Hora was kind of against the whole welfare system type of thing. Like, it seemed to me, because he was against like the whole medical system, and he's like, all these people go to the doctors all the time, and actually doctors make people more sick a lot of the times. But really, if people would just acknowledge that reality is an illusion, then you will not get sick. And either seeing everything as energy, or that everything is an illusion, everything's like a dream. You can heal yourself. You don't have to go to a doctor. The doctor, Dr. Hora would say, confirms illusion that you are a body and stuff, and all that, right? So maybe there's some validity to that. But again, I thought that this was white supremacy, because I'm like, oh, so he's just against the welfare system and the medical welfare system, like against Bernie Sanders wanting free Medicare because he's just a white supremacist. And of course, the white people would be against, the welfare system and Medi-Cal and stuff like that. So again, but at the same time, because they're just victim blamers. And according to Dr. Hora, the reason why you get sick is because you have invalid thoughts, and you're not in the flow. You have existentially invalid thoughts. But I'm like, that's just victim blaming. No, it's because of genes. But again, when I see things as genes, then in Darwinism, then I'm expressing myself in a way that's existentially invalid. Then I'm trying to have babies out of wedlock, and I'm trying to be, and I'm thinking of myself as Jewish. I'm a Marxist because I want to defeat the white race, as opposed to oneness consciousness, seeing everything as energy, And, you know, maybe my grandpa's right. You take responsibility, see everything as energy. It's an anti-entropic ordering function. And you don't need to go to the doctor if that's the case. You know, they say that so much money is wasted going to the doctor, and the doctors a lot of times actually hurt people more. So, but again, like I was like, no, Eliphaz, you know, Eliphaz means love of gold, and he was just an Edomite who was half Hittite, which means he was sort of Indo-European, and he's a victim blamer, and the Bible wants to get people out of victim blaming. But at the same time, though, I have to acknowledge the victim is to blame in a lot of ways, because the way you see things does affect your reality. So that's what my grandpa's saying about being an existentially valid way of seeing, mode of seeing. And if I see things as energy and everything is one, and anti-entropic ordering function, as opposed to Darwinian Marxist Freudian perspective, which is materialistic, then it would probably have better results. And even to the point where if I really saw things as they are, my grandpa would say, you can move a mountain. Because you recognize everything as an illusion, you maybe can move a mountain. Now, like I said, when I saw myself as Jewish and I was anti-spiritual, anti-religious because I saw it as white supremacy, I would be like, no, you can't move a mountain. That was just a metaphor, you know. Mountains in the Bible represent leaders, and Jesus was just a Marxist, and he was saying you can move leaders if you have faith, and faith means to be a Marxist. And, you know, the story where Jesus, you know, feeds the people with the fish represents, you know, or he gets the fish out of the water. The fish represents followers, and because it says the people, the followers are fish, and the fish give him a drachma coin, and that just represents his followers will give him money to support his ministry. And I didn't want to believe in the spiritual and the supernatural, right? And the idea that everything is energy and everything is one, and that you can literally move a mountain. I want to believe that was just a metaphor. But again, my grandpa said, which one is more existentially valid? You know, I want to see things in a Marxist way, but that ends up hurting me. Because then I start acting, I start, you know, trying to have babies out of wedlock, and, you know, kind of like acting like Marx did. Marx even did that. Marx tried to have a baby out of wedlock with his maid and stuff, right? Kind of acting satanic. Because Satan, and I started to realize in Hinduism, was against religion and against spirituality. He was against Vishnu. He was against preservation. And that's the way I was. I was a Marxist, and I was against victim blaming. But I have to acknowledge what my grandpa says. Your mode of seeing does affect your reality. So in a way, you do create your reality. And you know, in a way, I did mess up a lot. I saw things in Darwinian perspective, and I did a lot of stuff that made mistakes. But at the same time, I was a victim. You know, the shoot-away machine was a tragedy, and, you know, all this stuff. But again, my grandpa said, what can you do? Instead of blaming and complaining and stuff, just try to go all out. But again, like I said, I felt like my grandpa hurt me, though, because then my mom and dad misinterpreted his teachings, and then they became victim blamers and very mean and callous, and they didn't understand his teachings, and my grandpa didn't help them to understand. So anyways, the reality can be messy, but my point, though, is I started to understand my grandpa's teachings. I started to understand what he's saying. To see things in a spiritual lens is more existentially valid. It leads to more happiness. And it might even be accurate. You know, maybe it is true what he says, you know. Like I said, I want to believe it's genes that create your personality. But my grandpa said, no, previous lives. And again, I hated that because I'm like, I hated religion. I hated that idea because I'm like, okay, well, that's just conservative, and that justifies the status quo. And people say, oh, this guy's doing so well because in his previous lives he was, you know, Mozart is so profound because in his previous lives he was good, you know. And my grandpa said he wasn't good, but he had a existentially valid way of seeing things, and you know, so on and so forth, right? But I didn't like that. But instead I want to be like, no, it's just your genetics. But then if I'm thinking it's just genetics, I'm thinking the world in a Darwinian lens, and then I'm acting in a Darwinian lens that leads to suffering. And I'm trying to, as opposed to my grandpa saying, all that matters is just inquiry, expanding your awareness so you can be receptive to the truth, receptive to insight, inspiration. So, you know, I wanted to be like, no, it's genetics, it's genes. You know, you're not to blame. That's victim blaming. It's victim blaming, and it's victor extolling, and it maintains the status quo. But at the same time, like, maybe my grandpa's right. You know, follow the Bible. Like I said, I think a lot of black people, they act angry and they act very egomaniacal and stuff because they're trying to be anti-religious, because they're trying to destroy society, because they feel like they're victims, right? But at the same time, you know, or, you know, because of the idea that, you know, because they are victims and they've been oppressed, then they don't have education, so they act in a negative way, right? And But my point is, though, my grandpa would say, all that you can do is you can upgrade your software. Don't make excuses. Don't do cause and effect thinking, oh, I'm acting like this because I've been oppressed and because of, no, all that matters is it doesn't matter. Just upgrade your software. See into the point where you can see things as they really are and ultimately get to the flow, but at least to transcend the materialistic way of seeing things and see everything as energy, everything as one, and try to be a beneficial presence as opposed to a beneficial person. So that's all I can say.